Chapter 10, Decline and Decay of the Merovingians, 561–656, by Charles Oman. The sons of Clothar divide the Frankish realm, wars of Sigebert and Chilperic, the fortunes of Brunhildes, continued wars of Neustria and Austrasia, tyranny of Chilperic and Fredegundes, decay of the royal power among the Franks, the house of St. Arnulf and Pippin, Brunhildes regent in Austrasia, wars of her grandsons, her death Clothar II, sole king, his weakness, his successor Dagobert I last free king of the Merovingian line, rise of the mayors of the palace. After the first 80 years of its existence, the Frankish kingdom, which under 3 generations of warlike monarchs had continued to extend its borders so fast and so far, ceased suddenly to grow, and was given up for a century and a half to ruinous civil wars, as objectless as they were tedious and confused. In surrendering their primitive Teutonic freedom to their royal house, in return for the glory and aggrandizement which union under a single despotic hand gave to their hitherto weak and scattered tribes, the Franks had bartered away their future. As long as the House of Clovis were able and active, their subjects could console themselves for submitting to an autocrat by sharing in the power and plunder which a century of successful war brought into them. But when the Merovingians, though still retaining their despotic authority, grew weak and incapable, showing no trace of their ancestors' qualities, save an inveterate tendency to treachery and fratricide, an evil time came upon the Frankish race. They paid for their early aggrandizement by being condemned to 5 generations of useless civil wars at home and powerlessness abroad, while their hereditary monarchs sacrificed everything to their unending family feuds. Nothing more could be hoped for the Franks till they had rid themselves of the nightmare incubus of this wicked house, whose repulsive annals are, on the whole, the most hopeless and depressing page in the history of Europe. From generation to generation, their story reeks with blood. There is nothing that can be compared to it for horror in the records of any nation on this side of the Mediterranean. We have to search the histories of the courts of Mohammedan Asia to discover a parallel. The Franks only found salvation in the growth of checks on the royal power by the development of the great provincial governors, and by the final deposition of the Merovingians in favor of the great house of the descendants of St. Arnulf, the mayors of the palace, whose strong hand at last stayed the fratricidal wars of the 7th century. And even when the new dynasty had mounted the throne, the Frankish realm showed fatal signs of the demoralization it had suffered under the old royal house. The tendency of the race to acquiesce in the unwise habit of heritage partition and the unhappy grudge between the Eastern and the Western Franks were direct legacies of the Merovingians. We left the whole Frankish realm concentrated in the hands of the aged Clothar, last surviving son of Clovis. Second partition of the Frankish realm, 561. When, however, this hoary ruffian, fresh from the murder of his eldest son, sank into his grave, in the year 561, his 4 surviving children parted the kingdom once more among themselves, not without a preliminary fight, in which Chilperic, the youngest of the 4, having laid hands on his father's treasures and raised an army with their aid, tried to put down his kinsmen, but failed. When he had been defeated and brought to submission, the realm was made into 4 shares. Charibert, the eldest son, took Paris and Aquitaine, Guntram the Burgundian kingdom, Sigebert the Ripuarian land on the Rhine, and the tributary Thuringian and Bavarian lands beyond it. Lastly, the restless Chilperic was given his father's original share, the old Salian land between Meuse and Somme, with certain districts farther south added to it, so that it extended nearly as far as the gates of Rouen and Reims. The Frankish kingdoms, 575. Of these 4 brothers, Charibert died young in 567. He is only remembered because his daughter Bertha married Ethelbert, the king of Kent, and was, 20 years later, the protector of the mission of St. Augustine. Charibert's lands on the Seine and Loire were parted among his 3 brothers, Guntram and Chilperic each taking the part that lay nearest to his own frontier, while their distant Ripuarian brother, Sigebert, had Tours, Poictiers, and Bordeaux, separated from his other dominions by the whole breadth of Burgundy. The tale of the wars and tumults which the 3 surviving sons of Clothar I raised against each other is a long recital of objectless strife and treachery. The uneasiest spirit of the three was the wicked Chilperic, the Nero and Herod of his time, as Gregory of Tours very rightly styles him. The usual fraternal hatred of the Merovingians was embittered between him and Sigebert by an additional grievance. While Sigebert was away beyond the Rhine striving with the wild Avars, who had pushed their incursions along the Danube into Bavaria and Swabia, his brother, the king of Soissons, invaded Ripuaria and tried to seize it for himself. Sigebert returned in haste and succeeded in driving Chilperic back beyond the Meuse and preserving his eastern border. This would have been cause enough for revenge, but a worse was to follow. Chilperic and Sigebert had married two sisters, the daughters of the Visigothic king Athanagild. Galswintha was the spouse of Chilperic, Brunhildes of Sigebert. They were princesses famed all over the Western world for their beauty and abilities no less than for the enormous dowries which their father had bestowed upon them. Murder of Galswintha, 567. Before his marriage, Chilperic had kept a perfect harem of concubines, though on the arrival of Galswintha, he had for the moment banished them. But Fredegondes, the chief among his former favorites, retained such an empire over him that after a few months he openly brought her back to the palace and insulted the queen by her presence. When Galswintha indignantly declared that she should return to her father, the wicked king had her murdered and publicly married Fredegondes within a few days, 567. Brunhildes, the sister of the murdered queen, and the spouse of Chilperic's elder brother, the king of Ripuaria, devoted the rest of her life to the task of avenging Galswintha's death on the king of Soissons and his paramour. She was a strong-willed, fearless, able woman, and her influence over her husband was unbounded. For 40 years, the houses of Sigebert and Chilperic and their unhappy subjects were destined to shed their blood on the battlefield that the slaughter of Galswintha might be atoned for. It is in these wars that the final partition of the Frankish realm into its two permanent divisions took shape, and that new names for these divisions came into use. The Ripuarian realm of King Sigebert, from the borders of Bavaria and Thuringia as far as the Meuse and Scheldt, is for the future known as Austrasia, the Eastern Kingdom. Chilperic's less purely Teutonic realm, from the Meuse and Scheldt as far as the Loire, gets the name of Neustria, the New Kingdom, or the New West Kingdom, as others interpret it. The annals of Metz say, Occidentals Francae qui Neustriae dicuntur. Its boundaries were the Scheldt, the Silva Carbonaria about Namur and Mons, and the Upper Meuse. Verdun is the westernmost Austrasian town, Langres the northernmost Burgundian town. The beginning of the Wars of Neustria and Austrasia follows immediately on the death of Galswintha. As the avenger of blood, King Sigebert entered his brother's kingdom and drove him westward, but the hostilities were suspended by a great Lombard invasion of Gaul. The new conquerors of Italy had passed the Alps and thrown themselves upon the Frankish realm. Guntram of Burgundy, whose kingdom bore the brunt of the assault, prevailed upon his brothers to cease their struggles and unite to cast out the Lombards from Provence and the Rhone Valley. By his decision, Chilperic gave up as weregeld for his wife's murder, her dowry and 5 Aquitanian cities, which had been bestowed upon her at the marriage. These were made over to Brunhildes, who took them, but nevertheless bided her time for a fuller revenge, 568. 4 years of Lombard wars kept the Frankish kings engaged on their southern borders, and they were at last successful in forcing the invaders beyond the Alps, in a series of campaigns in which the chief glory was gained by the Romano-Gallic Duke, Unius Mummalus, who led the armies of Guntram of Burgundy. Wars of Sigebert and Chilperic, 573–75. But in 573, the civil war between Sigebert and Chilperic burst forth again. It spread at once over the whole of the Frankish realm, for Chilperic attacked his brother's dominions in Aquitaine, while Sigebert pressed on beyond Meuse and Scheldt. There followed 2 years of fierce fighting, attended by the most barbarous wasting of the land. Chilperic's sons burnt every open town between Tours and Limoges. Sigebert's troops from beyond the Rhine devastated the valley of the Meuse. The Austrasians had the better in the struggle, and Chilperic sued for peace, offering large territorial concessions. But it was his life, and not his lands that Brunhildes wanted. Her husband was induced to decline his brother's proposals and pushed his victorious arms into the heart of Neustria after a battle in which Chilperich's son and heir, Theudebert, was slain. The king of the west abandoned his capital and fled north to hide himself and his wife behind the walls of Tournai. Most of the Neustrian counts came to do homage to Sigebert at Paris, and when he had chased his brother behind the Scheldt, the Austrasian had himself lifted on the shield, according to old Frankish custom, and saluted as king of all the Franks at Vitry near Arras. Murder of Sigebert, 575. He sent for his wife and children to Paris to share in his triumph, and determined to end the war by the siege of Tournai. But when all Gaul seemed at his command, 2 murderers, hired by Queen Fredegundes, came before him with a pretended message, and stabbed him while he listened to their words, 575. The death of Sigebert changed the whole aspect of affairs in Gaul, and raised his assassin from the depth of despair to the height of fortune. The Austrasian army dispersed when its commander was slain, and the Neustrian counts flocked to Tournai to do homage again to Chilperich. Queen Brunhildes, who lay at Paris with Sigebert's infant son and heir Childebert, was seized and imprisoned by the partisans of the Neustrian king. Her little 4-year-old son only escaped from his uncle's clutches by being let down in a basket from his mother's prison window and received by a faithful adherent who rode away with him to Metz. If Chilperich had laid hands on the boy, the Austrasian royal house would have been ended in the promptest way. The East Frankish counts and dukes, when the news of Sigebert's death reached them, resolved not to submit to his murderer, but to take a step unheard of heretofore in the annals of the Merovingians. When they found that the boy Childebert had escaped, they bound his father's diadem about his brows and saluted him as king. Hitherto the Franks had always lived under the strong hands of a grown man, and the provincial governors had been as powerless as the meaner people under the autocratic sway of the ruler. But in the long minority that would follow the accession of a 4-year-old child, they found their opportunity for lowering the royal power and dividing many of its privileges among themselves. From this point begins the degradation of the kingly office, which was to be the rule henceforth among them, and the counts and dukes, as well as the great officers of the palace, were destined to acquire, in the early years of Childebert, a control over the central power which they had never hitherto possessed. Meanwhile, the fate of the little king's mother, Brunhildes, had been a strange one. Chilperich had seized her treasures and thrown her into prison at Rouen. Adventures of Brunhildes. There she caught the eye of Merovich, her captor's eldest surviving son, who was charged by his father with the command of an army destined to attack the Austrasian king's dominions beyond the Loire. Merovich was so infatuated by the beauty of the captive queen that, braving his father's displeasure, he delivered her from her dungeon and induced Predicstatus, Bishop of Rouen, to marry them in his cathedral. King Chilperich immediately flew to Rouen in great wrath, and at his approach, the newly married pair took sanctuary under the bishop's protection. After some hesitation, the king of Neustria promised to spare their lives, but when his son surrendered himself, he took him away to Soissons, and shortly afterwards tonsured him and compelled him to become a monk. Brunhildes escaped to Austrasia, whither her husband strove to follow her. He fled from his monastery and had almost reached the frontier when the emissaries of his stepmother, Fredegundes, caught him and murdered him, 577. In Austrasia, there now commenced a struggle between the liberated Queen Mother and the great officers of state for the guardianship of the little 6-year-old king. The struggle was an obstinate one, for if the Frankish nobles were hampered by the autocratic traditions of the kingship, Brunhildes, on the other hand, was a foreigner and met with little support save among the Gallo-Roman clergy and officials who found some protection under the shield of the king from the arrogance and violence of their Frankish fellow subjects. In Neustria or Aquitaine, where the Roman elements were stronger, Brunhildes might have done more, but her lot was cast in Austrasia, where the Germans were entirely preponderant. The Merovingian kings of the Franks, A-752. To protect the young Childebert against the attacks of Chilperich, his mother allied herself with the boy's uncle, Guntram, king of Burgundy. Guntram, who had no children of his own, designated Childebert heir to all his dominions and took up his cause with vigor. But he was not a very warlike prince, and it was as much as he could do to protect his own realm against the active and ruthless king of Neustria. Though Burgundy and Austrasia were allied, Chilperic succeeded in conquering their united armies under the Burgundian general Mammalus and seizing Tours, Poictiers, and all the north of Aquitaine. He would probably have carried his arms further if internal troubles had not arisen to check him. The Bretons of Armorica burst into rebellion and had to be put down, and other risings were excited by his ruthless and excessive taxation, atrocities of Fredegundes, but his worst vexations were those of his own household, caused by the strife of his elder sons with their stepmother, Fredegundes. All through these years, the wicked queen had been fearfully active. Theudebert and Meroving, the eldest of her husband's family, were dead, but their brother, Clovis, still stood between Fredegundes' children and the throne. In 580, the plague swept all over Gaul, and 2 sons of Fredegundes were carried off by it. She accused their stepbrother of having caused their death by witchcraft and got her husband to permit her to execute him. But when her last child died, 2 years later, the wretched woman's rage and grief led her into the wildest outbursts of cruelty. She accused numbers of persons about the court of magic arts practiced against her boy and burnt them alive or broke them on the wheel. Many other acts of murder and treachery are attributed to her, notably the death of Praetextatus, Bishop of Rouen, whom she detested for the part he had taken in the marriage of Meroving and Brunhildes, and her crimes fill many a page in the gloomy annals of Gregory of Tours. A legend tells how 2 holy bishops once stood before the gate of the palace at Soissons. "What seest thou over this house?" said one. "I see nothing but the red standard which Chilperic, the king, has ordered to be set up on its topmost gable." "But I see," said the first, "the sword of God raised above that wicked house to destroy it altogether." Meanwhile, Chilperic's wars with his brother of Burgundy and his nephew of Austrasia continued to fill central Gaul with blood and ashes. They ceased for a moment when the Austrasian nobles, against the will of Brunhildes, forced their little king to make peace and alliance with his father's murderer. But no one could long trust Chilperic, and after less than a year, the old league between Austrasia and Burgundy was renewed. Death of Chilperic I, 584. In 584, Chilperic, to the great joy of all Gaul, was murdered by an unknown hand. As he was returning from the hunt to his royal manor of Chelles, a certain man struck him with a knife beneath the shoulder and pierced his belly with a second stroke, whereupon he fell down and breathed out his foul soul, says the chronicler. He was perhaps the worst of the wicked Merovingians, cruel, unjust, gluttonous and drunken, vain, boastful and irreligious, the worthy son of the ruffian Clothar and grandson of the murderer Clovis. But his untiring energy and reckless courage bore him safely through many an evil day, and he died leaving the kingdom he had inherited in 561, increased to 3 times its original bulk. Queen Fredegundes had borne one more son, named Clothar, to her husband just 4 months before his murder, so that Neustria was not left altogether without an heir. But Fredegundes feared that Guntram and his nephew would now seize the whole realm and slay her with her infant. She took sanctuary at Paris, but when the king of Burgundy arrived, he showed his superiority to the morals of his family by sparing the life of the wicked queen and recognizing her son as king of Neustria. Brunhildes sought in vain to induce Guntram to give over to her the murderess of her husband. He refused, and Fredegundes took advantage of his kindness to hire assassins to make attempts on the lives both of Brunhildes and her son, the young king of Austrasia. Luckily, the project failed in both cases. The civil wars of the Franks now ceased for a moment. Guntram, a mild and not unamiable character, controlled both his nephews, the 15-year-old Childebert of Austrasia and the 1-year-old Clothar II, and for 9 years the 3 kingdoms had a certain measure of peace, broken only by wars with the Lombards and Visigoths. Wars with Goths and Lombards. Guntram seems to have hoped that the fratricidal wars of his family might be staved off for a space by turning the energy of the Franks against their southern neighbors, and engaged himself in a war with Recounts, king of Spain, while the Austrasian nobles were induced by the gifts of the Emperor Maurice to assist the Byzantines in their struggle against the Lombards. Both wars were long and fruitless. In the west, the repeated attacks of the Burgundian armies on Septimania were all beaten back. In the east, the Austrasians twice crossed the Alps and wasted the valley of the Po, but in 588 they received such a defeat at the hands of King Othari that they made peace with him and withdrew across the Alps. In 590, Childebert, who had now attained his 20th year and was governing for himself, renewed the struggle, but his army was thinned by famine and pestilence before the walls of Verona, and he was finally fain to renew the peace with Agilulf, the successor of Othari. Unfortunate foreign wars, however, were better than strife in the heart of Gaul, and the last years of Guntram were fairly free from this pest. He was only troubled by one rebellion, a conspiracy between his illegitimate brother, Gundovald, and two great Romano-Gallic dukes, Mamalis and Desiderius, who were apparently wishing to become kingmakers and rule under the name of an obscure and incapable pretender. But the day of the complete triumph of the great state officials over the kingship had not yet come, and though he was for a moment master of all Aquitaine, Gundovald was easily put down and executed in company with his chief supporter Mamalis, 585. Guntram died in 593, and his nephew Childebert received his dominions in Burgundy and Aquitaine, thus becoming ruler of 4/5 of the whole Frankish kingdom in his 23rd year. Under his nominal sway, Austrasia had been the theatre of a long struggle between his mother Brunhildes and the great counts and dukes, whose plots and riots were secretly abetted by Fredegundes. From her home in Neustria, the ruthless widow of Chilperic did her best to set her nephew's kingdom in disorder, and promised lands and titles to the Austrasian chiefs if they would murder Brunhildes and Childebert, and proclaim her own son, Clothar, king of Austrasia. But the stern and able Brunhildes unraveled and crushed all these conspiracies, and had the triumph of seeing her son attain his majority and assume the rule in his own name. Brunhildes attacks Neustria. The moment that the Pacific Guntram was dead, Brunhildes and her son, freed from all restraint, set out to punish the intrigues of Fredegundes, and by invading Neustria to make an end of her and her boy Clothar. But the fortune of war declared in favor of the Western Franks. At Droisy, near Soissons, the army of Childebert was defeated with the loss of no less than 30,000 men, and Neustria was saved from conquest. The war continued without definite result, for Childebert was prevented from using his full strength by a rebellion beyond the Rhine, among the Warni in Suabia. Probably his superior force must in the end have carried the day, but the entire aspect of affairs was suddenly changed by his unexpected death in 596, at the early age of 26. He left two infant sons, Theudebert and Theuderic, to the care of their grandmother, who found herself, though she was now verging on old age, once more called upon to assume the regency. The death of Childebert was to the kingly authority a fatal blow, from which it never recovered. His own long minority had raised the counts and dukes to a pitch of power which they had never gained before, and all the efforts of Brunhildes had not succeeded in fully holding them down. The equally long minority of his sons was the last blow to the kingship. Their grandmother struggled with all her might to retain the power for the kingly race and to curb her unruly subjects. But though she worked with untiring energy and zeal and kept the reins of government in her own grasp for some time, the treacherous nobles, bent on their own aggrandizement at the expense of the royal authority, were at last too much for her. Second regency of Brunhildes, of the two sons of Childebert II, Theudebert, the elder, became king of Austrasia, Theuderic, the younger, king of Burgundy, the legacy of his uncle Guntram. It was an uneasy inheritance to which they succeeded, for Fredegundes saw her opportunity and urged the Neustrians forward against her great-nephews. At Lafox near Laon, the Austrasians suffered a great defeat, and all the lands as far as the Meuse fell into the hands of the Queen of Neustria. But in the moment of triumph, her son's throne being now firmly established, and her rival's power on the decline, the wicked Fredegundes died at Rouen. Her countless murders and cruelties met no chastisement on earth, and the son for whom she had risked so much was destined to carry out to a successful end the schemes in pursuit of which she had so long striven, and to unite all the Frankish realms under his sceptre, 597. The death of Fredegundis brought no relief to Brunhildes. For 2 years more she struggled on against the intrigues of the Austrasian nobility. Duke Wintrio, who led the opposition against her, was seized and executed in 598. Exile of Brunhildes. But in 599, a final rising took her by surprise, and she was forced to fly alone and unaccompanied from Metz to save her life. She escaped to Burgundy, where she took refuge with her younger grandson Theuderic, and was there received with all honor. 2 successive mayors of the palace, Protadius and Claudius, both of Romano-Gallic blood, lent themselves to her schemes, and the royal power in Burgundy was still upheld by her strong hand. The curse of fratricidal wars was never to depart from the house of the Merovingians. When Theudebert II and Theuderic II grew up and reached early manhood, they united for a moment to attack their cousin Clothar and to recover from him the lands between the Meuse, the Seine, and the Loire, with Paris, Rouen, and Tours. But soon after they fell to strife, and it would seem that the old Brunhildes was greatly to blame for its outbreak. She was burning to revenge herself on the Austrasian nobles for the banishment she had endured at their hands, and stirred up the Burgundians to war. She and the mayor Protadius were far more eager than the counts and dukes of Burgundy to begin the strife, and when the 2 armies came in sight of each other, the soldiers of Theuderic lowered their weapons, slew Protadius when he strove to force them on, and compelled their young king to make peace with his brother. Wars of Theudebert II and Theuderic II, 612. But the curse that rested on the Merovingians was not so easily to be exorcised. Brunhildes and Theuderic were determined to have their way, and ere very long the war was renewed. The Austrasians were beaten at Toul, their lands wasted, and the victorious Theuderic forced his way as far as Zulpich, in the very heart of his brother's realm. Here Theudebert withstood him for a second time, was again beaten, and fell into the hands of the Burgundians. He was led before his grandmother, who assailed him with bitter reproaches and bade him be tonsured and become a monk. But this did not content the king of Burgundy. A few days later, he had his brother dragged out of his monastery and put to death, 612. The revenge of heaven seemed to be called down by the wicked deed of the young king of Burgundy. Only 5 months after his brother's murder, he was smitten down by an attack of dysentery and died at Metz in the very prime of his early manhood, 613. Now, for the 3rd time, the unhappy Brunhildes was left alone, with a helpless child as her only stay. Once more she steeled her heart and faced the situation. She led her great-grandson Sigebert, the eldest son of Theuderic, before the assembly of the East Franks, and bade them do homage to him as king of Austrasia and Burgundy. For a moment they bent before her, and Sigebert II was acknowledged as ruler of the East Franks. But the Austrasians were determined to have no more of Brunhildes' rule. They sent secretly to Clothar, king of Neustria, and bade him arm and invade his cousin's realm, for no hand should be raised against him. When the Neustrian king marched into Austrasia, Warnachar, the mayor of the palace, and most of the nobles of the land took arms and joined him. Brunhildes with her great-grandson fled to Burgundy and raised an army there, with which she faced the Neustrians near the headwaters of the Aisne. But when Clothar's army came in sight, the Burgundian patrician Alethius and the dukes Rocco and Sigvald led off their troops and joined the invader. In a moment the whole of Sigebert's army had deserted or dispersed. Death of Brunhildes, 614. Brunhildes and the little king fled away as far as Orb, hard by the lake of Neuchatel, where the emissaries of Clothar overtook and captured them. They were led before the king of Neustria, the worthy son of Fredegundis. "Here is the woman," he cried, "by whose intrigues and wars 10 princes of the Franks have come to their deaths." And he bade his soldiers scourge the old queen, and then bind her by hands and feet to the heels of a wild horse, who dragged her among stones and rocks till her body was torn limb from limb. The boy Sigebert and his younger brother Corbo were strangled. We can reckon Theudebert, son of Chilperic, and Theudebert, son of Childebert, slain in battle. Chilperic, whose murder was sometimes put down to Brunhildes by her enemies. Sigebert, who was murdered in a war to which Brunhildes had urged him, Merovich, who was murdered for marrying her. But who were the other 5? Thus perished Brunhildes, and with her the greatness of the house of the Merovingians. For the future, it was the counts and the mayors of the palace who were to exercise real power among the Franks, and not the kings. Clothar, who had conquered only by the treachery of the nobles, was, with all his descendants, to be their servant, not their master. Considering that she was a woman and a foreigner, it is wonderful that Brunhildes continued for so long to sway the councils of Austrasia. Save her abilities and her force of character, she had no advantage, yet she not only dominated in succession her husband, her son, and her grandson, but held down the unruly counts and dukes, who were neither allied to her by blood nor constantly under her eye and influence. Character of Brunhildes. The tale of her life has sufficiently shown her qualities and defects, that she was something more than a fury stirring up war and strife from personal revenge for the blood of her sister and her husband is clear enough. She was an administrator of marked ability. Almost alone among the rulers of the Franks, she is noted as a builder and a founder. Churches, hospitals, and monasteries she erected in great numbers. The old Roman fortresses and military roads were also her care. To this day, some of the high roads of Belgium still bear her name, and as the Chaussées de Brunihaut preserve her memory as the first potentate who cared for them after the Franks came into the land. That she was a sincerely religious woman would seem to be vouched for by the series of her letters to Gregory the Great, which moved the good pontiff's admiration. But sincere piety was not in those days, any more than in our own, inconsistent with a headstrong impatience of opposition and an unscrupulous readiness to sweep obstacles out of the way. There is no doubt that Brunhildes struck down the Austrasian counts by the dagger, as well as by the sword, when they intrigued against her. She never forgave her own grandson Theudebert II for allowing her to be driven out of his realm, and was not satisfied till 10 years after his offense she caught him and forced him to become a monk. Her enmity pursued not only Fredegundes and Chilperic, the murderers of her sister and husband, but their young son and their subjects long years after they themselves were dead. Yet, if she was relentless and unforgiving, we must remember that few rulers in history have suffered such wrongs and faced such odds. Compared with her contemporaries, Brunhildes might almost pass for a heroine and a saint. Clothar Roman II, though he became king of all the Frankish realms by the murder of Brunhildes and her great-grandchildren, acquired little real power thereby. The Austrasians and Burgundians, who had combined with him to destroy the old queen, wrung terms from him which deprived him of many undoubted regal rights. The Dukes Warnachar and Ratho, who were made mayors of the palace of the two realms, stipulated that they were to hold their offices for life, not at the king's pleasure. Decay of royal power. For the future, the mayorship became an office of far greater importance than it had yet been. Another step in the weakening of the kingship is shown by the fact that the legislation of the Franks from this time forward is always noted as being done by the king, with the counsel and consent of his bishops, counts, and dukes. A code of laws which Clothar Roman II put forth for the Swabians somewhere about the year 620 is endorsed not merely with his own authority, but with that of 33 bishops, 34 dukes, and 65 counts. The fact that the reign of Clothar was exceptionally fertile in legislation is probably to be accounted for by the fact that he was compelled to listen to the demands of his nobles and grant redress to their grievances, rather than by any particular taste of his own for the enacting of laws. When, for example, we hear that he met the mayor Warnachar and all the bishops and great men of Burgundy at Bonneuil, and there assented to all their just petitions, we must remember that he was facing an irremovable mayor of the palace, and a nation who had freely given themselves into his hands on stated terms, and had no longer over them the unlimited authority that a Clodovch or a Theuderic had owned 100 years before. Troubles of Clothar Roman II. Nothing can show more clearly the growing weakness of the king than an incident which occurred at a great national gathering of Neustrians and Burgundians at Clichy towards the end of his reign. In the midst of the council, a brawl arose, and the followers of a duke named Agina slew Ermenhar, the steward of the palace of the king's son. At once all the Neustrians seized their arms and drew apart into two bands. While Agina and his friends seized the hill of Montmartre and formed their array on its brow, the larger party, headed by Bradulf, a kinsman of the slain man, started off to storm the position. The king was only able to keep the peace by inducing the Burgundians, who were not interested in the quarrel, to follow him and to promise to attack whichever of the two sides should strike the first blow. He dismissed the assembly and was unable to punish anyone, either for the murder or for the riot which had ensued. Clothar, with his diminished royal prerogative, seems to have had neither the opportunity nor the power to engage in wars of conquest beyond the bounds of his realm. Samo and the Slavs, he had to look on without stirring, while a great, if ephemeral, kingdom was built up beyond his eastern frontier. Behind the Thuringians and Bavarians, on the Elbe and Oder, there had dwelt for the last 200 years, since the German races had migrated westward, a group of small and disunited Slavonic tribes, calling themselves Wiltzes, Sorbs, Abatrites, and Czechs. Their dissensions had kept them from being dangerous neighbors till the time of Clothar. But about 620, a Frankish adventurer named Samo, who had gone eastward, half as trader, half as buccaneer, united many of the Slavonic tribes and became their king. He gradually extended his power all down the valley of the Elbe, on both sides of the Bohemian mountains, and was soon to prove himself a serious trouble to the realm of the Merovingians. Towards the end of his reign, Clothar II made his son Dagobert king of Austrasia while he was still a very young man. The chief counselors by whose aid Dagobert administered his realm were two men whose names form a landmark in Frankish history: Arnulf, Bishop of Metz, and Count Pippin the Elder, the ancestors of the great house of the Carlings. St. Arnulf and Pippin the Elder. Bishop Arnulf was the wisest and best of the prelates of Austrasia, and after a long life of usefulness in church and state, won the name of saint by laying down his crozier and ring and retiring to a hermitage to spend his last 15 years in the solitudes of the Vosges. Count Pippin, a noble from the land between Meuse and Moselle, whose ancestral abodes are said to have been the manors of Herstal and Landen, was appointed mayor of the palace and lived in the closest concord and amity with Arnulf. They cemented their alliance by a marriage, Bega, the daughter of Pippin, being wedded to Ansegisel, the son of the bishop. For Arnulf, like many of the Frankish clergy, lived in lawful wedlock. From these parents sprang the whole of the line of mayors, kings, and emperors whose mighty deeds were to make their comparatively unimportant ancestors famous in history. King Clothar II died in 628, and his son, Dagobert I, became ruler of all the Frankish realms. He was, for a Meroving, a very creditable ruler, though he lived with 3 wives at once and indulged in occasional outbursts of wrong-headedness. For the 2 first years of his reign, he chose to share the sovereign power with his brother Charibert, whom he made king of Aquitaine out of pure fraternal affection. But when Charibert died, in 630, he resumed his southern dominions, disregarding Charibert's 3 sons. Reign of Dagobert I, 620–838. Dagobert was the last of the Merovingians whose will was of much importance in the ordering of the Frankish realms. His successors were to be mere shadows. Even in his own time, the royal power was already of little force in Austrasia, where the king leant entirely upon the support of Pippin, who, with his son-in-law Ansegisel, held the post of mayor of the palace for the whole 16 years of Dagobert's reign. His loyalty to the king concealed the fact that he was far more powerful in the Eastern Kingdom than Dagobert himself. The king had several sharp quarrels with him, but never dared to depose him from his post, lest trouble should ensue. In Neustria, no great mayor of the palace had yet arisen, and there Dagobert was ruler in fact as well as name. Hence, it is not surprising that he always dwelt west of the Meuse and made Paris his favorite residence. Dagobert was the last Meroving who took arms to extend the limits of the Frankish power. He supported the pretender Sisinand in Spain by the aid of a Burgundian army, made an alliance with the Emperor Heraclius against the Lombards, and entered into a protracted war with the Slavonic tribes of the east. On the Elbe, the kingdom of Samo, the Frank was now at the height of its power. Dagobert took alarm at its rapid growth. and when the Wends plundered part of Thuringia in 630, sent against them 3 great armies, comprising the whole military force of Austrasia. 2 of these expeditions fared well, but the third suffered complete annihilation at Wagistisburg in Bohemia, and the victorious Slavs ravaged Thuringia and Bavaria, from Saal to Danube, with fire and sword, till Radolf, Duke of Thuringia, at last checked them in 633. Dagobert I died in 638. He left 2 sons, Sigebert Roman III, aged 9, and Clovis Roman II, aged 6. It was the long minority of these 2 boys which finally achieved the ruin of the Merovingian house. While Sigebert and Clovis were growing up to manhood, the future of the Frankish realms was being settled by the sword, the all-important issue at stake being the question whether the House of Pippin and Arnulf should retain permanent possession of the Austrasian mayorship of the palace or should sink out of sight. Pippin the Old died in 639, the 2nd year of Sigebert's reign. His son Grimoald at once proclaimed himself heir to his father's office. Grimoald, mayor of the palace, but a great part of the Austrasian nobles, headed by Otto, the foster-father of the young king, refused to acknowledge his right to the mayorship, and a fierce war of 3 years was required to settle the dispute. At last the son of Pippin conquered, and for 14 years, 640–56, was undisputed master of Austrasia. King Sigebert, indeed, grew up to man's estate, but he was completely dominated by his servant and never made any endeavor to take the power out of his hands. Hence he is known as the first of the Rois Fainéants, or do-nothing kings, who were from henceforth to be the rule among the house of the Merovingians. In Neustria, meanwhile, the royal power was saved for a time by the cleverness of Queen Nenthildes, a lady of great piety, the widow of Dagobert, who acted as guardian for her younger son Clovis. She enlisted in her cause the Neustrian mayor of the palace, Erchinoald, who was akin to the royal house himself, and therefore not unfavorable to its dominance. Not till these 2 passed away was the western realm to sink into the same state as the eastern. But the fall of royalty here, too, was now imminent.